Not all fantasies are built the same. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for spending some time with me. So I know the thumbnail of this video probably says Hobb versus Lawrence versus Tchaikovsky. And the truth is, I am not pitting these against each other. I wanted to explore these three really great fantasy series. The first one being the Farseer Trilogy by Robin Hobb, and then the Library Trilogy by Mark Lawrence, even though only the first two books of that have been published. And then the Tyrant Philosopher series by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which at the moment is a trilogy, but it may expand into more books. What got me thinking about this and inspired me to make this video was in January, I read in succession. First, I read the last book of the Farseer trilogy, and then I read the second book of the Tyrant Philosopher series, and then I read the first book of the Library trilogy in that order, and I realized how wildly different they are, yet they are still categorized as fantasy. All of them fall into this genre category, yet they are incredibly different. Now, since then, I have finished all three books that are published of the Tyrant Philosopher series, and I've read the first two books of the Library trilogy. As I said, the third one doesn't come out until April of 2025, so I haven't read that yet, but I've caught up otherwise. And of course, we know that any genre has many subgenres, right? So within fantasy, there's all these different subgenres. And so you could just look at the different subgenres, I suppose, that these would be classified in. And that would give you a taste of how they're different. But I wanted to look at them because I think all three are really great entryways into the fantasy genre. And depending on what you like or don't like, you may be attracted to one and not another. So I wanted to look at them next to each other. Not to say that one is better than the other, because I really enjoyed all three of them, but just to share my impression of the three of them and maybe give you a taste of them. So if you're interested in jumping into fantasy and you don't know where you want to start, this would give you three options that are wildly different from each other, yet still hold the heart of fantasy deeply in their claws. First, let's talk about the few things that I do have in common, other than just being contained within this large genre of fantasy. There isn't a lot, actually. I think one of the things that you can look at is they all seem to focus around this preternaturally gifted orphan or orphan type character. Now that's a little harder to show in the Tyrant Philosopher series because there isn't one main character, but I think it's still there. And this is a trope you see in a lot of stories, right? It's not unique to these three, but the main character fits in the Farseer trilogy, and the two main characters of Levira and Evar in the Library trilogy, and a number of the primary voices that we see throughout the Tyrant Philosopher series are already characters who start from a place of being disadvantaged, whether they are actual orphans or whether they are just, on the bottom run of society and they aren't considered worthy or important or capable in any way, and yet they have these gifts that aren't expected of them. Now, those gifts may be magically imbued, or they may just be due to their intelligence or their wit or their perseverance, but because of that, they have some sort of gifts that allow them to excel not just out of their station, wherever they've been cast in life, but beyond anyone's wildest dreams. I think that kind of trope is common in a lot of fantasy, and you do see it in all three of these. And so that kind of heartwarming tale of the underdog does come across in all three of these. I think something that's important with looking at these three is that none of them are cynical. They aren't grimdark. They have dark moments. They have death. They have abject despair in some cases, but they always have almost a sense of romanticism about them, right? That there is some sort of underlying optimism about the potential of this world, even when things seem doomed, even if there is mass bloodshed or violence or betrayal. So they aren't cynical, they aren't grimdark. Grimdark is a whole different modality of writing and character building and world building within fantasy and sci-fi and other speculative types of fiction, and these all are absent from that. So they don't have cynicism, and it's not like they're happy all the time, but they do have some sort of emphasis, whether it is explicit in the text or in the character's actions, that is focused around the innate capacity for goodness within humanity, right? So that is there, even though that may be what's being contested in some of the stories and some of the plots, that is up for grabs, but they don't approach it with this nihilistic or grimdark attitude. So that's one thing that is similar between all three of these. And then another similarity across the three of them is that they aren't structured essentially as a good versus evil story. There's definitely antagonists and protagonists within the stories, but it isn't the case that there's one antagonist that represents all evil. Even that antagonists are complicated characters, and they have different motivations and reasons for doing what they do, which make sense to them. It isn't about pure power or pure evil for the sake of being evil. It isn't about pure domination or control. There's always other factors. Now, you may find those to be more successful or not. I know especially in the Farseer trilogy, the main antagonist, some people feel like he is underwritten and that he's just kind of petty. And the way he develops into almost a mustache twirling villain at the end, they feel like is a step too far. I don't think that's the case. I think Hobb does a great job of humanizing him and showing how he became who he is. But even in that case, it isn't pure evil, right? So these stories aren't about good and evil. They're about individual journeys. They're stories of humanity and people trying to live in a chaotic, complicated world and do the best they can. So that also sets them aside from other types of fantasy genre, but is similar in all three of these. And then the last thing I think that's actually similar is that they all have epigraphs before every chapter. So every chapter starts with something preceding it and a little epigraph, but they use them all differently. And now this is something you see in a lot of fiction. It's common in fantasy, I think, because it gives the author a chance to just add a little extra, right? A little special sauce onto every chapter. But the funny thing is the way they use them is wildly different. So in the Library Trilogy by Mark Lawrence, before every chapter, there's a quote from a book, but most of these are books that have been invented by Mark Lawrence, and they only bear a little bit of consequence on what's going to happen in that chapter. They might point to an idea or a theme, but more they're just there for the reader's delight. And I think they're a chance for Mark Lawrence to kind of, be a little bit playful in an otherwise potentially catastrophic world that he's built and has taken apart. In the Tyrant Philosopher series, every chapter follows the point of view of a different character, but preceding every chapter, the epigraph, is from the point of view of an omniscient narrator. And so that omniscient narrator does a job of filling in some backstory, filling in some history, giving you context, especially if this is a character you haven't met before, or they're going to a part of the world that you haven't explored before. So that actually is doing a lot of important narrative work and exposition. And it still is written in the same writing style and tone as the overall story. So you feel the dry wit and the pathos that comes from Tchaikovsky's writing, but it isn't written from the point of view of any character. So it's giving you important context for what you are immediately going to be reading. And then in the Farseer trilogy, it's different still, because the whole framing device of the Farseer trilogy is that Fitz Chivalry, the main character, he is writing a history of the six duchies. He is writing a history of the world that he grew up in. Every chapter starts with him trying to write part of this history and then being distracted with his memories, and his memories then lead him into the actual events of the chapter. So there is a connection. You see how this historical thing, or this discussion of the magic system, or this discussion of a certain type of people or clan or country or city or what have you, that leads him into whatever memory he has to continue the narrative. But it isn't directly connected. It's more of a feeling or a vibe. But what it is doing is showing the emotional state of our main character at the end of his journey, even though you may be at the beginning of his journey, or wherever you may be within the trilogy. So it provides a different role because it is giving context for the individual chapter, but it's also giving context for the end, for where he ends up and how he gets there, and how he exists when this journey is completed. So there is some sort of foreshadowing happening in all these epigraphs. But so you can see all three of them have epigraphs, and yet they use them wildly differently. One of them is playful, one of them is really giving important context, and one of them is creating an overarching story and pointing to something much bigger than that individual chapter. Okay, so let's get into how they're different. I think the first thing is that the writing styles and the pacing is different in all of them. The Farseer trilogy is written from a first-person point of view. It is very intimate, and the plotting is somewhat slow. This is all the memories of an older man, and he starts when he is 6 years old. That's when the story starts, and it goes through his journey, right? And so it's his memories of what it was like to be a child, put in the situation he was in, and his experiences growing up and trying to navigate the world. He is a royal bastard who is brought back to the court when he's 5 or 6 years old, and he isn't really wanted there by many people, and yet the royal assassin takes a shine to him and starts teaching him or training him to be an assassin. That, the first book is called The Assassin's Apprentice for that reason. So it is this really small story in some ways, even though the world he's in is much bigger, and there are huge stakes happening, and the six duchies, the country or the kingdom that he lives in, is under attack by these, I guess you could say they're kind of like pirates, but they don't really want anything except to cause death and destruction. And then within the six duchies, there are these six provinces, and there's some rebellion happening, and then there are questions about the king's health and who is going to take over the throne when he dies, and all these things are happening internally. So there are these big storylines happening, but our story is still really small and intimate because it's following our one character's perspective in the midst of this chaos. Now, the Tyrant Philosopher series is chaos incarnate, especially the first book. There are so many points of view, at least a dozen, if not more. And so it is multiple point of view to the max. And because of that, you're constantly moving around the city, and it's telling a bunch of small different stories in that world, and the stories are interweaving, they're overlapping with each other. You see one point of view character in another character's chapter and so forth, but It is very fast paced. It's moving at a very, very high speed, and it's doing so in a way that still feels connected. It gives you depth to all the characters. It doesn't shy away from having real emotional impact, yet it doesn't stay in any one place too long, because it isn't about individuals. It's about how everyone is experiencing this situation, right? And so in the heart of the Tyrant Philosopher series, it's about this country, Palestine, who have realized or decided that they have reached perfection, quote unquote. And since they have reached perfection, it is their duty to spread that perfection to the whole world. And so they slowly have started spreading out from their small little archipelago, and they're conquering one country after another to spread perfection. So the first novel in the series is set in the city of Ilmar, which has been under occupation for over 3 years, and yet it's a time of revolution. And that's why it is called the City of Last Chances. And you see revolution fomenting with different groups, with the academics, with the working class, with the upper class, with the organized crime and the underbelly. All these different groups are trying to foment their own rebellions against the oppression of this occupation. Now, in the second novel, we move from a city under occupation to the battlefield. We go to the battlefield of the Palestine army, and we are part of the Palestine army in an experimental hospital clinic, a bunch of misfits put together in this chaotic situation where they are employed using uncommon techniques to deal with the chaos of battle. And then in the third book, we're in another country entirely, which is not yet under Palestine occupation, but the Pals have their eyes on it, and our main character is essentially an ambassador for the Palestine army. For the Palestinian government, and you are looking at what it means to be in a state of preoccupation, right? And they're having their own succession problems as well. So because of that, you're following all these different storylines in each novel, but they intersect with each other. So this close third person with many, many, many points of view, wildly different tone and story writing and style than in the Farseer trilogy. And then that comes to the Library trilogy, which is actually somewhere between the two of those. Now, first off, I should say the Library trilogy is categorized as fantasy. You could also categorize it as science fiction, I think. And the way you delineate speculative fiction into science fiction and fantasy, I think, is a little bit arbitrary. You know, if it has aliens or robots, then it is science fiction. And if it has wizards or knights, then, or maybe dragons, then it is fantasy. That seems like a little bit of an arbitrary distinction, right? So this is categorized as fantasy, but it does feel almost more sci-fi in its approach. And what it's really doing is playing with both these genres and showing how these distinctions aren't entirely useful. But this, at least the first novel, has 2 points of view only, so it still has this real intimate feeling. You're looking at a specific story. You're not looking at this whole world, though the whole world is collapsing and growing and collapsing and growing around you. The end of it being and the re-emergence of being is happening both in your history, in your future, and in your present, but you're focused on these two characters who are circling around each other throughout time and throughout space. And so it's very intimate in that way, but it's still written in a close third person point of view. So you have an eagle eye approach to it, where you understand more than your individual characters do, unlike in the Farseer trilogy. Now, in the second book, in the Library trilogy, it does open up a little bit. So there are more than 2 points of view. I'd say maybe a half dozen in total. Still far fewer than the Tyrant Philosopher series, and still it is focusing on the individual stories of those characters. It isn't focusing on the story of the world as much as it is the characters within that world. It has happened to expand to a few more characters. So you can see that just the approach to writing fantasy is different here. One of them is a very intimate story about one character's journey. That's why it's written in the first person. It really pulls you in, and it doesn't rush you. It takes your time going through this character's life. Then there's one which has more characters than you can count, because the characters aren't the point. The characters are the pawns on the chessboard, and the real story is about the world. It is about what is happening around those characters. And the third one is a story of the characters, but it is a small group of characters as they're navigating the world they're in. You have a more objective point of view because you get to see how they experience the world in relation to each other. And I would even approach the idea of pacing in a similar fashion. So Farseer trilogy is much more slower paced. It isn't slow or boring, and it always is moving, but it doesn't feel rushed in any way. And the Library trilogy is right in the middle, you know, that there's always things happening and there is an urgency to it, but it doesn't feel like it's out of control at any time. And the Tyrant Philosopher series constantly feels like barely controlled chaos, so the pace is much faster. You're always moving on and on. But because the story is so big in scope and it's looking at a whole world system instead of individual characters, you don't have these cliffhangers hanging over everything. So there's no kind of emotional manipulation in the same way you might have in other stories that feel like they're rushing ahead. They all are incredibly well written, and they all have this incredible depth to their characters and to the worlds that they've built. And so because of that, regardless of how they approach those characters or how they approach storytelling, they do it in a competent way that pulls you in and makes you excited. but you have to know, like, what kind of stories are you interested in? Do you like things that take your time and walk with you hand in hand to give you this real, very personal, very intimate, very vulnerable exploration? Then you're going to want the Farseer trilogy. Do you want something that has you rushing to and fro, that feels like it's always going to explode out of control, and yet somehow contains all of this and has all this pathos and pith and meaning and humor throughout? Then the Tyrant philosophers are going to be for you. And if you want to find that balance, if you want to find something that does have momentum, but also plays with your perception and your assumptions, and is interested in telling a story not just of characters, but also of a place and how they interact with each other, then the Library trilogy is for you. So, slow, fast, and medium in the terms of their plotting, but also in the terms of how you experience the relationship between the characters and the world. The Farseer trilogy is pretty traditional high fantasy. It is a secondary world fantasy that really feels like medieval Europe. And the difference here is there are a couple different magic systems that are in place, but they are not widely used across the populace. One is called the Wit, and this is a magic system that's also considered like an old magic that has to do with animals and a relationship between humans and animals, and being able to understand the minds of animals to some extent, and the ability to have these intense emotional and psychic bonds with animals. That's called the Wit. And then you have another magical ability called the Skill, which is almost like a type of telepathy that can be learned in many people. It is something that is passed from generation to generation and is especially strong in certain families, but hypothetically many different people can learn the skill. And so these two magic systems are important to the story, but they aren't the heart of the story, and they aren't widely used across the story. And in fact, many characters think poorly of them, and they think that if you're someone that practices the Wit, that makes you more animal than human, and you have to be excommunicated and things like this. So other than that, it's this medieval Europe kind of setting. And now the world is fantastical in the fact that there are talk of dragons and other mythical beasts that throughout our story, our characters don't have any living memory of them, but there are stories of them, and we believe that they exist in this world. And if you look at the realm of the Elderling series as a whole, so the Farseer trilogy stands on its own, yet it is the first trilogy in a 16-book series, which has 5 different sub-stories within it. And other ones do involve mythical creatures and more fantastical elements than you see in the Farseer trilogy. So knowing that as a greater context, you do know that this world does have things that are far beyond our experience in our world, but it still feels like our world. And in that way, it's very traditional heroic fantasy. The Tyrant Philosopher series feels like an urban fantasy, yet an urban fantasy that is set in a pre-industrialized nation. Or nations, I should say. There are demons, there's other types of magic, and it is commonplace across the society to have these supernatural events and experiences and characters. And different cultures and different people have different opinions about them, but it exists very commonly. Necromancy and other fantastical creatures, and all these sorts of things populate this world in a way that is just understood and is expected. And the Library trilogy, as I said, that is more in the realm of science fantasy, where for a big part of the story exists in one library, but this library is never ending in size. As far as we know, this library is infinite. It has an infinite number of rooms. Every room is 2 by 2 square kilometers. And this library has existed since the beginning of time, as far as we know. There's all these mythologies about the library. And the library itself serves as a nexus where you can travel across different world systems and across different times. So the library is the heart of the story. But then the city that is built around the library and what is done with the knowledge of the library is also an important part of the story, because that's the whole reason for the library existing, is to both preserve and share knowledge. And what does that mean for these people? So it doesn't have the same kind of scope or feeling as the other 2 trilogies. It feels more contained, even though what is being contained is this infinity of space and time. And then the last thing that I want to discuss about the differences between these 3 is some of the themes or underlining ideas that are being explored in the trilogies. In many ways, the Farseer trilogy, our character is going on a quest by the 3rd one. There is like a very typical quest narrative that he has to go do something or find someone, and he's going on a journey. The first 2 don't have that quest narrative. It's him trying to survive and live in the kingdom where he isn't really wanted by most people, especially the people in power. And so because of that, there is this emphasis on what it means to rule. What is the responsibility of a ruler, of a good leader? And what is the role of your humanity in learning what it means to control a kingdom? Like I said, our main character is a bastard. And so there are these questions of abandonment and what it means to be ignored, what it means to be misunderstood, what it means to have power that you don't understand. Because as you can assume, and I don't feel like I'm spoiling anything, that I talked about there being 2 different magic systems in this world, right? The Skill and the Wit. And I think it's safe to assume when you go into a story like this that your main character is going to have some relationship to at least one, if not both, of those magic systems in a way, because that's why he's our main character, right? That's why he is the preternaturally gifted orphan. He is the character that has skills that people don't expect him to have. And so because of that, you have this question of responsibility and of family loyalty and what is expected of you, and is that fair to be living under the expectations of others. So these kind of dynamics are what are explored about unity, about kingdom, about filial expectations, about responsibility, but what it means to be a good leader, what it means to be powerful, right? What is the cost of power? What is the price of power? What is the responsibility of power? These are all kind of the ideas that are looked at in this story. And that way, it doesn't have a particularly political or social agenda as much as it is a personal, introspective reflection on what it means to exist in this dynamic, in this power struggle, and in this society where certain things are valued and others are not valued. And that is in big contrast to the Tyrant Philosopher series, which is all about political ideas, right? So the whole thing is about this colonizing country. And what does it mean? What is the hypocrisy and fragility necessary to be an autocratic government who colonizes and expands and is looking for both intellectual and psychological expansion as well as territorial expansion? And what does it look like to resist that? So the first novel is all about resistance. What does it mean to resist? What does it mean for there to be solidarity among oppressed and marginalized peoples? And how can that solidarity empower you to resist something or to stand up against something that is so much more powerful than yourself? And even if you know your chances of surviving or winning or succeeding are very slim, you still have a moral obligation to do that anyway. So that is what's explored in the first one. It gets a little muddier and messier as the story expands, as you start following Palestine characters as your main points of view. Then you have to ask, where does your responsibility lie? If you can exist as a bug in the ointment, essentially, and if you are saving lives, if you're helping people, it doesn't matter whose uniform you're wearing, what responsibilities do you have as a human being? And so there are constant political observations happening and social observations happening, because the whole story is about colonization and about imperialism and about the downfalls of that, and how the creeping tendrils of autocratic thought affect every level of society in all different ways. And some of that does mean bringing progress, but that progress is always at a cost, and it isn't asked for or requested. And yet at the same time, there's no preachiness in these stories. The Tyrant Philosophers series is not interested in telling you what you should believe, but it is showing this chaotic situation and looking at the ramifications of it from more than one side. Everything is morally gray. Even the characters you root for engage in some harmful actions, and they don't always present their best selves to the world. So it's not a black and white situation, but it is interested in these political and social themes, much more so than the Farseer trilogy, even though both of them are looking at rulers who are trying to amass power for themselves in different ways. And then as a result of that power, they are exploiting and abusing the people below them. But the lens through which you're exploring power is wildly different between those two. One of them is non-political, it's about a personal journey, and one of them is looking at society and specifically exploring the political ramifications of this type of government system and of the, solipsism or the egoism that is involved in autocratic tendencies, and the idea that you should expand both in terms of your physical territory and also in terms of psychological or intellectual control of different people's beliefs and systems. And then the Library trilogy is doing this really interesting combination where you're looking at this very intimate story of these individuals. Really, it's two individuals, but they also have small groups of people around them. So there's a few small groups that you're following, and you're following their story, but their story is set amidst the question of what is the power of knowledge, and how is knowledge to be preserved, and is knowledge to be presented? So there's this question of who deserves knowledge, and do we need to earn the knowledge we have? Or if we have gone through a period of tumult where we raise our city to the ground, should all of our knowledge just be given back to us, or do we have to earn it? Do we have to relearn it for ourselves if we want to not commit the same mistakes in the future? So at the heart of the story is knowledge, how knowledge is transmitted and preserved. But around that knowledge, then you have the ideas of community, and how communities either uphold and support knowledge or are against it because it threatens their dominancy, right? And then that comes into play with ideas of violence and how one community may be pitted against another community, again, in pursuit of either grabbing onto more knowledge and power as a result of knowledge, or the belief that your knowledge is correct and others are incorrect. And then, of course, mixing through all of that is who knows best for you? Who is the one that runs this library? Who is the one that makes the decisions about who gets knowledge and who doesn't get knowledge? Who makes the decisions about which rooms of the library are open to whom? Who has access? Who gets to decide that you have to learn this on your own versus no, we're going to give you the accumulated knowledge of all your ancestors? Who gets to make that decision? What does it mean to have autonomy in a place where certain things are hidden from you? Is that true autonomy or not? In this context of these bigger philosophical questions, then you have this intimate story of these characters that are spiraling around each other, that feel like they are destined to smash against each other and then push away from each other at the same time. And so it combines these somewhat important philosophical ideas about knowledge and about understanding and about community and about being in the world, about what it means to understand how to exist in the world, and if that is knowledge that needs to be given or earned. So that bigger philosophical inquiry is done through the lens of this storytelling of these intimate characters who may or may not be throwing a wrench into the whole gears of how this world develops itself. You know, the second book is called The Book That Broke the World. So there's something about that, right? And then the third book is called The Book That Held Her Heart. And now again, I haven't read the third book yet. It isn't out yet. And I was actually denied an advanced reader copy. So I'm going to read it with everyone else in about a month when it gets released. But there's something about the relationship and the importance of human relationship and how that relates to the importance of maintaining knowledge, preserving knowledge, withholding knowledge, or sharing knowledge, and how the personal and the communal relate together. So that is one of the themes that is at the heart of the library trilogy. So I think I'm going to stop there because I could keep running my mouth more and more and more about all three of these series because I really enjoy them. I think they're all great series. I think they're all great entryways into the fantasy genre, and I think they offer something different. So if you're someone who is tentative about exploring fantasy, or if you already love fantasy but you don't know which series you want to jump into next, I think looking at these three different series and how their writing styles are different, how their tones are different, their pacing is different, and the way they're exploring personal and larger themes is different, gives you an opportunity to see which of these is more in your lane at the moment. I know for me, I could tell you in this moment, if you were to offer me to read one of these three series, which one I'd pick, because that's how I'm feeling right now. But that isn't because I enjoy that series more. It's because like my emotional state right now would draw me towards one versus the other. I think all three of them are great series. I really, really enjoyed my time with all three of them. And I've enjoyed continuing in Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings with her other series. And I've read already one short story from Tchaikovsky that is set in the world of the Tyrant philosophers. I know there's a novella coming out later this year and hopefully more stories in this world. So I'm really excited if he does that. And there is one more book in the library trilogy coming up soon. I'm hoping to read that when it's released. And there's a number of short stories that I haven't read yet. So I'm hoping between now and the release of that third book to read some of those short stories so that I'm fully caught up. And I believe those short stories don't involve any of our main characters, but they do involve that world. So I want to know as much about that world as possible. Because again, all three of these series are great. I think that you can jump into any one of them and have a great time. I recommend all three of them highly. I'd love to know what you think about these series. Have you read any of them? Let me know down in the comments which of these you've read, what you think about them, how their writing style and how the themes they explore and how their tones have affected your reading experience. And if you enjoy one more than another, let me know about that too. I'd love to hear what you think it is about certain types of fantasy writing, whether it be a subgenre or a writing style or a writing modality that appeals to you versus another one. I'd love to hear all your thoughts about that down in the comments. For now, though, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.